The morning mist clung to the Wabash River Valley like a ghostly shroud, as if nature itself sensed the blood that would soon stain the fertile Indiana Territory soil. In the pre-dawn darkness of November 7th, 1811, two forces stood on the precipice of a conflict that would reshape the American frontier forever. On one side, the Shawnee prophet Tippecanoe and his confederation of native warriors. On the other, William Henry Harrison, governor of the Indiana Territory, leading 1,000-strong militia and regular army soldiers. The fate of the Northwest Territory hung in the balance, though neither side fully grasped the historical significance of what was about to unfold. Months earlier, Harrison had watched with growing unease as the charismatic Shawnee leader Tecumseh and his spiritual brother Tippecanoe, known to settlers as the Prophet, united tribes across the frontier in resistance to American expansion. Their settlement, Prophetstown, had grown from a small encampment to a formidable village housing over 1,000 Native Americans from various tribes. Governor Harrison's correspondence reveals his deep concern about the growing Native Confederation, which he described as the most serious threat to American settlement since the end of the Revolution, notes historian Robert Thompson in his work, Frontier Conflicts: The Struggle for America's Interior. Harrison was determined to assert American authority before Tecumseh's confederation grew too powerful. The ambitious governor had acquired millions of acres through questionable treaties, and native resistance threatened both his political aspirations and American expansion. When Tecumseh departed on a southern journey to recruit Cherokee and Creek allies in the autumn of 1811, Harrison saw his opportunity. "I will put an end to this nest of trouble before it grows further," Harrison wrote to Secretary of War William Eustis. "The prophet's influence must be broken while his brother is away." With authorization from President Madison, Harrison assembled a force at Vincennes, about 900 men, including 400 regular army soldiers and 500 militia volunteers from Kentucky and Indiana. Their mission was ostensibly to establish a new fort near Prophetstown and force the prophet to disperse his followers or accept American terms. The soldiers marched north through the wilderness in late October, their blue and buckskin-clad column cutting through forests ablaze with autumn colors. Many were farmers and frontiersmen, hardened by life on the edge of the American frontier. They carried flintlock muskets, wearing broad-brimmed hats or coonskin caps, with powder horns slung across their shoulders. As the American force approached Prophetstown in early November, tension filled the air. Tippecanoe, left in charge during his brother's absence, faced a crucial decision. Tecumseh had explicitly instructed him to avoid conflict until their confederation was stronger, but the prophet was proud and believed in his spiritual powers. When Harrison's forces established camp on a plateau near Burnett's Creek, about a mile from Prophetstown, native scouts brought word immediately to the prophet. In his lodge that evening, illuminated by flickering firelight, Tippecanoe consulted with war chiefs from the Winnebago, Potawatomi, and Kickapoo tribes. Young warriors argued passionately for attack, while older chiefs counseled patience. "The white soldiers violate our lands like a disease that spreads," declared a Winnebago war leader named White Crow. "Tonight, they sleep unguarded, believing we fear them." The prophet had been losing influence in recent months after several failed prophecies. He needed to reassert his spiritual authority. Rising dramatically before the assembled war council, his face half-shadowed, Tippecanoe raised his arms and proclaimed that the Master of Life had visited him with a vision. "My brothers, the Great Spirit has shown me our path," he announced. "He will make the white soldiers weak and blind in battle. Their bullets will not harm our warriors. The time to strike is now." As darkness fell completely over the forests and prairies, the decision was made. Hundreds of warriors began painting their faces by firelight, preparing for battle. Harrison's men, meanwhile, slept fitfully in their camp, weapons close at hand, unaware that swirling events had already set them on a collision course with destiny. The American camp stood silent under a clear November sky as the clock approached 4 in the morning. Governor William Henry Harrison had ordered his men to sleep fully clothed with their weapons within reach, a precaution that would soon prove prescient. His force had formed a triangular encampment on a wooded rise overlooking Burnett's Creek, with infantry companies forming the perimeter and mounted riflemen positioned in the center. Harrison himself rose before dawn, as was his custom. The 48-year-old governor and military commander was already dressed and pulling on his boots when the first gunshot shattered the pre-dawn stillness. According to Harrison's own account, he had just risen and was preparing to rouse the camp when the attack began with a most horrid yell, writes historian Patricia Cleary in Contested Territories, Native Americans, and the Making of the Midwest. Outside his tent, chaos erupted. The native warriors had approached silently through the darkness, creeping within 30 yards of the American sentries before a vigilant guard spotted movement and fired his musket. Immediately, the night exploded with war cries as hundreds of warriors surged toward the American lines. The initial assault fell heaviest on the northern angle of the camp, where Captain Robert Barton's regulars and Captain Frederick Geiger's Kentucky volunteers frantically formed ranks in the darkness. Through the mist and smoke, the Americans could make out warriors rushing toward them, faces painted black and red, many armed with traditional war clubs and tomahawks alongside trade muskets and rifles. Harrison later wrote that the flashes of the guns showed a substantial force of several hundred, attacking from multiple directions. Tenskwatawa watched the battle unfold from a rocky outcrop near Prophetstown, chanting sacred words and raising his arms toward the heavens. He had promised his followers that his magic would turn the Americans' bullets to sand and shield the warriors from harm. His reputation, perhaps the entire native resistance movement, now hung on the outcome of this desperate pre-dawn gamble. Within the American camp, Harrison mounted his white horse and galloped toward the heaviest fighting, narrowly avoiding death when a bullet passed through his hat. The governor's presence steadied the line as he shouted orders above the din of battle. When he discovered the left flank weakening, he personally led a group of dragoons to reinforce the position. Captain Spear Spencer's Yellow Jackets, called for their bright yellow-fringed hunting shirts, bore the brunt of a vicious assault on the southern end of the camp. Spencer himself fell with a bullet through his head, and his 2 lieutenants were quickly cut down beside him. The line threatened to crumble. "Hold fast, men of Indiana," Harrison shouted as he galloped up. "Reinforcements are coming." Major Floyd's company rushed to stabilize the position, forming a new line as the Yellow Jackets fell back. Across the encampment, the disciplined regulars and frontier militia began to find their footing in the fight, forming solid firing lines that delivered devastating volleys into the charging warriors. White Crow, the Winnebago war leader who had advocated for the attack, led repeated charges against the American lines. With eagle feathers in his hair and bearing a war club handed down through generations, he rallied warriors with both his courage and his contempt for death. During one rush, he reached the American line and crushed the skull of a Kentucky rifleman, before being driven back by bayonets. "They cannot kill us," he shouted to his men. "The prophet's medicine protects us." But the warriors were discovering the limits of spiritual protection. With each charge, native fighters fell to American bullets. As the first light of dawn illuminated the battlefield, the bodies of dozens of warriors lay scattered across the bloody ground before the American position. Confidence in Tenskwatawa's prophecies began to waver. Back at the rocky outcrop, the prophet continued his chants with increasing desperation, unable to understand why his spiritual powers were failing. He had predicted an easy victory. Now, he watched as his warriors died beneath American guns, their blood staining the frost-covered grass as morning approached. As dawn suffused the eastern sky with pale light, the battle entered its 3rd hour. The American lines had held, though at a heavy cost. 27 soldiers lay dead, with nearly twice that number wounded. The native warriors had melted back into the forest and tall prairie grass, still firing sporadically but no longer mounting the coordinated charges that had characterized the night's assault. Harrison, his uniform stained with mud and gunpowder, rode along the perimeter, organizing stretcher parties for the wounded and strengthening positions in case of another attack. The governor's face was grim but resolute. He had anticipated conflict, though not quite so soon or so fiercely fought. Few first-hand accounts of the native side of this battle exist, but oral histories collected years later suggest a growing disillusionment among the warriors as their casualties mounted, notes ethnographer James Runningwolf in Voices of Resistance, Native American Oral Histories of the Early Republic. Near Prophetstown, a bitter council was underway. Several war chiefs confronted Tenskwatawa, demanding to know why his spiritual protections had failed. Warriors who had lost brothers and sons spoke harshly, their faith shattered by the morning's losses. "You said the white man's bullets would turn to sand," accused a Kickapoo leader named Blackfish, whose son had died in the attack. "You said the Master of Life would strike them blind." The prophet, his status rapidly diminishing, struggled to explain the failure. "Some among us must have broken the sacred taboos," he claimed. "Someone touched forbidden food or failed to perform the proper rituals." Few believed his excuses. By mid-morning, with no prospect of victory and fears of American retaliation growing, the decision was made to abandon Prophetstown. Women, children, and elders who had remained in the village during the battle now frantically gathered essential supplies. Warriors who could still fight formed a protective screen as the exodus began northward toward Potawatomi villages near Lake Michigan. Meanwhile, Harrison maintained a defensive posture throughout the morning, suspecting a potential ruse or second attack. His men strengthened their fortifications and tended to the wounded. Dr. Josiah Foster, the expedition's surgeon, worked frantically in a makeshift field hospital, amputating shattered limbs and extracting musket balls by the gory light, filtering through a canvas tent. "Most challenging were the tomahawk wounds," wrote Dr. Foster in his medical journal, preserved in the Indiana Historical Society. "The skull fractures were extensive, leaving little hope for those who suffered such injuries." By noon, when no further attack had materialized, Harrison dispatched reconnaissance patrols. Cautiously mounted riflemen advanced toward Prophetstown, expecting resistance at every tree line and ravine. Instead, they found an eerie silence. Smoke still rose from cooking fires hastily abandoned, but the village stood empty. Captain Waller, Taylor led the first detachment into the deserted settlement. "The enemy has fled and left much of their property behind," he reported upon returning to Harrison's camp. "There appears to be enough provisions to have supplied them for several weeks." The news of Prophetstown's abandonment spread through the American camp like wildfire. Soldiers who hours earlier had been fighting for their lives now realized they had won an unexpected victory. Harrison, ever the politician as well as soldier, recognized the significance immediately. "Providence has given us victory," he announced to his assembled officers. "Tomorrow we will destroy this nest of sedition root and branch." That evening, as the Americans made camp for another night, the wounded groaned in pain, while the able-bodied kept vigilant watch. 6 miles away, the dispirited Native Confederation trudged northward, their women and children carrying what few possessions they had saved, their warriors nursing wounds and burning with thoughts of revenge. Some blamed the prophet for their defeat, but others recognized the deeper meaning of the day's events. An elderly Wyandot warrior was heard to remark, "This is not the end but the beginning. The Americans will push harder now, and Tecumseh will return with a fury when he learns what has happened." Indeed, hundreds of miles to the south, Tecumseh was still meeting with potential Cherokee allies, unaware that his brother had ignored his explicit instructions and precipitated a disastrous confrontation. The consequences would reshape both the native resistance movement and the future of the American frontier. The morning of November 8th dawned crisp and clear. Governor Harrison stood at the edge of the captured Prophetstown, surveying what had been the largest Native American settlement in the Great Lakes region. Hundreds of structures stretched before him, bark lodges, log cabins, and the larger council house where Tecumseh and the prophet had once addressed representatives from a dozen tribes. "We found Prophetstown much larger than anticipated," wrote Major Marston Clark in his field journal. "By our estimate, it could have accommodated at least 1,000 souls, with extensive cornfields beyond." The contents of the abandoned village illustrated the complexity of frontier life. Traditional native crafts, woven baskets, quillwork, and stone tools stood alongside European trade goods, iron kettles, woolen blankets, and even several Kentucky-made rifles. Most valuable to Harrison's hungry troops were the substantial food stores, corn, beans, and dried squash that had been meticulously harvested and preserved for the coming winter. Harrison ordered his men to carry all useful provisions back to their camp. Everything else, every structure, Every fence post, every item too heavy to transport, was to be put to the torch. By midday, columns of thick smoke rose hundreds of feet into the autumn sky as Prophetstown burned. The scene resembled a vision from Dante, recounted Lieutenant Charles Larrabee in a letter to his wife in Vincennes. Flames consumed the Prophetstown while our wounded men moaned in the wagons. I cannot help but wonder if this day's work will bring peace or provoke greater violence. As flames consumed what had been the spiritual and political center of native resistance, Harrison held a solemn burial service for the American dead. 37 soldiers and militiamen were laid to rest in shallow graves near the battleground. To prevent desecration of the graves, the burial site was deliberately obscured. The ground was smoothed over, and fires built on top to hide the freshly turned earth. This somber practice of concealing burial sites after frontier battles speaks volumes about the nature of this conflict, observes military historian David Edmonds in Frontier Warfare, Tactics and Technology in the Early Republic. With their supplies running low and nearly 60 wounded men requiring transport, Harrison decided against further pursuit of the retreating native forces. His immediate objectives had been accomplished. Prophetstown was destroyed, the Prophet's influence shattered, and American military dominance reasserted. On November 9th, the American column began its slow journey back to Vincennes. News of the battle spread rapidly across the frontier. Harrison's official report reached Vincennes by November 15th and was quickly forwarded to Washington. Initial reactions were mixed. Harrison claimed an unqualified victory, but critics noted that his forces had been surprised in their camp and had suffered significant casualties against a supposedly inferior foe. The affair near Tippecanoe will require explanation, wrote Secretary of War William Eustis in his initial response. The president is concerned about the circumstances that led to the confrontation. For the displaced residents of Prophetstown, the immediate aftermath was one of hardship and recrimination. Winter was approaching, their food stores were destroyed, and their confederation appeared to be unraveling. Many families sought shelter with related tribes, while others struggled to establish makeshift camps as the November chill deepened. Tenskwatawa's influence collapsed almost overnight. Once revered as a powerful spiritual leader, he was now derided as a fraud whose false promises had led to disaster. When runners finally located Tecumseh in December and informed him of events at Tippecanoe, his rage was fearsome to behold. "My brother was instructed to keep peace in my absence," Tecumseh reportedly thundered. "Now our people are scattered, our village destroyed, and the Americans believe they have broken our spirit." In frontier settlements across Indiana and Kentucky, citizens celebrated Harrison's victory with bonfires and militia musters. Newspapers printed heroic accounts of the battle, and politicians rushed to associate themselves with the triumph. Harrison himself began crafting the narrative that would eventually help propel him to the presidency, emphasizing his leadership during the glorious victory at Tippecanoe. Yet among more thoughtful observers, a troubling recognition was dawning. The battle had not resolved the fundamental conflict, but merely transformed it. With Prophetstown destroyed and the spiritual movement discredited, Tecumseh would now fully embrace a military alliance with the British in Canada, an alliance that would bear bloody fruit when war was formally declared against Great Britain, just 7 months later. As 1811 drew to a close, few Americans recognized that Tippecanoe represented not an end, but a prelude. The broader struggle for the American continent was entering a new and more dangerous phase. By spring of 1812, the true significance of Tippecanoe had become increasingly apparent. Far from crushing native resistance, the battle and subsequent destruction of Prophetstown had galvanized anti-American sentiment throughout the Northwest Territory. Tecumseh, returning from his southern recruitment tour to find his confederation in disarray, channeled his considerable diplomatic skills toward forging a formal military alliance with British forces in Canada. The burning of Prophetstown accomplished precisely what Governor Harrison had hoped to prevent, writes historian Alan Taylor in The Civil War of 1812. It transformed a primarily spiritual and cultural resistance movement into an explicitly military one aligned with Britain. In British-controlled Fort Malden, present-day Amherstburg, Ontario, Tecumseh met with British Major General Isaac Brock. Their partnership would prove formidable in the coming conflict. While the Shawnee leader had lost faith in his brothers' spiritual leadership, he had lost none of his strategic vision or charismatic authority. Meanwhile, William Henry Harrison had returned to Vincennes a hero. Despite questions about his tactical decisions before the battle, he had successfully portrayed Tippecanoe as a decisive American victory. In taverns and public squares across the frontier, citizens toasted Harrison, the hero of Tippecanoe. The battle's political value to the ambitious governor was immediate and substantial. Few events have been so quickly mythologized in American history, notes cultural historian Simon Winchester. Within months, the battle was being depicted in popular prints and ballads, with Harrison at the center of an emerging frontier mythology. Washington. President Madison and his cabinet viewed developments with mounting concern. Relations with Great Britain were deteriorating rapidly over issues of maritime rights and trade restrictions. Reports of increased Native American activity along the Canadian border, now explicitly supported by British agents, added to the administration's worries. Henry Clay and other war hawks in Congress seized upon Tippecanoe as evidence that more aggressive measures were needed. The British puppeteers who pull the strings of savage warfare must be confronted directly, Clay declared in a fiery speech. Such rhetoric found fertile ground amid growing anti-British sentiment. On June 18, 1812, just 7 months after Tippecanoe, the United States formally declared war on Great Britain, beginning what would become known as the War of 1812. While maritime issues dominated the official justifications, the frontier conflicts epitomized by Tippecanoe had played a crucial role in building momentum toward war. For frontier settlements, the consequences were immediate and severe. Raids increased across Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan territories as Tecumseh's warriors, now supplied and supported by British regulars, struck American outposts and civilian settlements alike. The frontier war after Tippecanoe took on a brutality that shocked even veterans of previous Indian conflicts, notes military historian John Grenier. Both sides engaged in retaliatory violence that often targeted non-combatants. In August 1812, Native forces allied with Tecumseh achieved their greatest success when they participated in the capture of Detroit, where American General William Hull surrendered without firing a shot. The victory temporarily shifted the balance of power in the Northwest Territory and vindicated Tecumseh's decision to ally with the British. For the residents who had once called Prophetstown home, the war brought both opportunity and tragedy. Some found new purpose fighting alongside Tecumseh and the British. Others, particularly those from tribes less committed to the Confederation, sought neutrality or even alliance with the Americans. Tenskwatawa himself never regained his former influence. Though he attempted to rebuild a smaller version of Prophetstown along the Mississippi River, few Native Americans were willing to follow his spiritual guidance after the failure at Tippecanoe. He remained in Tecumseh's shadow, a diminished figure whose prophecies no longer commanded respect. Governor Harrison, meanwhile, leveraged his fame from Tippecanoe to secure appointment as commander of the Army of the Northwest in September 1812. He would later lead American forces to victory at the Battle of the Thames in October 1813, a battle in which Tecumseh himself was killed, effectively ending organized Native resistance in the Old Northwest. The path from Tippecanoe to the Thames represents one of the most consequential two-year periods in American territorial expansion, argues geopolitical historian James McPherson. What began as a local conflict over a prophet's village ended with the permanent fracturing of pan-Indian resistance east of the Mississippi. By 1814, when the War of 1812 concluded with the Treaty of Ghent, the strategic landscape of the American frontier had been transformed. British support for Native American resistance east of the Mississippi effectively ended, and American settlement surged westward with unprecedented speed. As the 19th century progressed, the Battle of Tippecanoe assumed mythic proportions in American consciousness, far beyond its tactical significance. When William Henry Harrison ran for president in 1840, his campaign slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, transformed a frontier skirmish into a political brand that helped carry him to the White House. Few military engagements in American history have been leveraged so successfully for political gain. remarks political historian Doris Kearns Goodwin in Presidential Mythology. Harrison's entire presidential identity was built upon this single battle. The battlefield itself became one of America's earliest historic sites. In 1835, the Indiana legislature purchased the land to create a memorial, and by 1842, construction began on an obelisk commemorating the American dead. The site became a pilgrimage destination for patriotic Americans, who viewed it as hallowed ground where civilization had triumphed over savagery. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe thousands attending Tippecanoe commemorations in the 1840s and 50s, notes public historian Barbara Smith. These events emphasized American heroism while largely erasing Native perspectives. For the Native peoples of the Northwest Territory, Tippecanoe represented something very different, a pivotal moment in a larger tragedy. The battle and destruction of Prophetstown accelerated the collapse of Native sovereignty east of the Mississippi. In the decades that followed, forced removals and broken treaties became the dominant pattern of U.S. Native relations. Maine Pock, a Potawatomi leader who had participated in the battle, later reflected, "Before the night at Tippecanoe, many still believed we could live alongside the Americans if they respected our boundaries. After the fires that consumed our great town, we knew the Americans would never stop until they possessed everything." This observation proved prescient. By 1819, the Treaty of Fort Harrison had forced the Miami and other tribes to cede most of central Indiana. By 1840, virtually all Native peoples had been removed from Indiana, either relocated west of the Mississippi or confined to small reservations. Tenskwatawa outlived both his brother Tecumseh and his adversary, William Henry Harrison. After the War of 1812, he fled to Canada before eventually returning to the United States. He died in 1836 in a small settlement near present-day Kansas City, largely forgotten by Americans but remembered among the Shawnee as a complex figure whose vision of cultural renewal had briefly united the tribes. In Shawnee oral histories, writes anthropologist Colin Calloway in Native Prophets and American Expansion, the prophet is remembered not primarily for the military defeat at Tippecanoe, but for his attempt to revitalize traditional practices and create a pan-Indian identity. Historical understanding of Tippecanoe continued to evolve throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Early accounts portrayed the battle as a straightforward clash between civilization and savagery. By the mid-20th century, more nuanced interpretations emerged, recognizing the complex political, cultural, and economic factors that had driven the conflict. Modern archaeological work at the battlefield has revealed new insights. Excavations in the 1990s uncovered evidence suggesting that Native forces had been more numerous and better armed than early American accounts acknowledged. Physical evidence also indicated that the battle had been more tactically sophisticated than the savage rush described in Harrison's reports. Archaeological findings at Tippecanoe have forced a fundamental reassessment of the battle, notes archaeologist Thomas Plummer. The physical evidence suggests a well-planned attack executed with considerable military skill. For contemporary Americans, Tippecanoe represents a complex legacy. A battle once celebrated unambiguously as a triumph of American arms, now understood as part of a morally ambiguous expansion that came at tremendous cost to Native peoples. The battlefield park today acknowledges both American and Native perspectives, attempting to present a more complete historical narrative. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Tippecanoe lies in how it accelerated the trajectory of American westward expansion. By weakening Native resistance, discrediting the prophet's spiritual message, and providing political capital for frontier expansionists, the battle helped clear the path for American settlement across the Trans-Appalachian West. When we trace the explosive growth of the American Midwest in the 19th century, observes economic historian Charles Foster, we can identify Tippecanoe as a crucial turning point, the moment when effective resistance to American expansion began to crumble. 2 centuries later, the echoes of that pre-dawn battle continue to resonate in American history and culture. What began as a clash in the Indiana wilderness ultimately helped shape the territorial, political, and cultural contours of an expanding nation. A legacy far more profound than any of the participants could have imagined On that fateful November morning in 1811,